Welcome back to ArkanSense. Today I'll be talking about ballot initiatives 3 and 4 of the 2018 Arkansas midterm elections regarding term limits and casinos. Ballot initiatives are laws that we all get to vote on, and issues 3 and 4 are also constitutional amendments. Unlike issues 1 and 2, which were sent to the ballot by the legislature, issues 3 and 4 got on the ballot by way of a citizen's petition. So let's talk about them, starting with issue 3, the Arkansas Term Limits Amendment. Issue 3 is about term limits for legislators serving in the Arkansas Senate and House of Representatives. If passed, it would repeal the existing term limits, replacing them with a 6-year term limit on representatives, an 8-year limit on senators, and a 10-year combined limit for anyone who serves in both. This limit includes any partial term served and applies all the way back to 1993, though anyone already over their 10-year limit when it passes would be allowed to finish the term they're serving right now. Finally, this amendment would prohibit legislators from making amendments to change these limits, meaning they could only be changed in the future through a ballot initiative started by citizens. Before we get into the arguments for and against, let's talk about how all of this works right now with a brief crash course on the General Assembly. The Arkansas General Assembly is the term for the two legislative groups that write and pass laws for Arkansas, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House has 100 members who each serve 2-year terms and are all up for election every 2 years. With a large number of members and a quick turnover rate, the House is built to respond more quickly to changes in Arkansans' opinions and to better represent the rural areas of the state. The Arkansas Senate has 35 members in 4-year terms. The elections for those terms are staggered, so every 2 years we vote for half of our senators, and this means that, unlike with the House of Representatives, the Senate could never be entirely replaced in just one election. This, and the longer terms, make the Senate a bit more stable and arguably more capable of making long-term plans, though we'll cover that idea more in a bit. But first, let's take a look at what term limits are in place right now and how they got there. Originally, there were no term limits for members of the General Assembly, but then in 1992, voters passed an amendment which set a 6-year term limit for representatives and an 8-year limit for senators. The exact same limits being proposed now, though the 92 amendment didn't include a limit on combined time. In 2004, legislators proposed an amendment which would have extended those limits, but the voters came out against it in force, and it was defeated by a large margin. Then in 2014, term limits showed up on the ballot again. This amendment made a large number of changes to the Arkansas Constitution, including setting new laws for lobbying and making it so members of the General Assembly couldn't give themselves a raise. One of its provisions was to repeal the 1992 limits and replace them with the 16-year combined limit, so legislators could serve 16 years in just the House, just the Senate, or some combination of both. The initiative passed, so that's the law of the land right now. So if you vote for this year's amendment, term limits would go back to the 1992 level, 6 years for representatives, 8 years for senators, plus the 10-year combined limit. If you vote against it, the rule will be 16 years total, period. For comparison, right now there are 15 states which impose term limits on their House and Senate, though 9 of those states only count consecutive terms. Out of all 15 states, Arkansas's limit of 16 years is by far the longest. So let's talk about the arguments for term limits. People who are in favor of term limits see them as a way to keep the government less corrupt. Ideally, a legislator who is term limited doesn't have as long to develop cozy relationships with lobbyists or special interest groups and might be less likely to be swayed or bribed by them. This argument might be especially persuasive in Arkansas right now thanks to an ongoing federal investigation into bribery, conspiracy, and corruption of at least 7 members of the General Assembly, all linked to one lobbyist. Term limits also fight what some people see as the problem of incumbent candidates being far more likely to win. An incumbent candidate is someone who currently holds a position and is running to keep it, and incumbents have a huge rate of re-election. For example, the approval rating for the United States Congress has held fairly low over the last decade, never getting above 40% according to most polls. You'd think that a low approval rating would lead to people voting in new candidates to try and change things, but it doesn't. Incumbents in Congress over the last decade have been re-elected more than 80% of the time. Why does this happen? Well, imagine you're running as an incumbent. Since you've already done this once and won, most voters have already heard of you. Some may vote for you just because your name is familiar or because you're already in office and they haven't heard anything bad about you. You also have a record of votes to point to, an existing fundraising structure, and you've known for years you'd be running again, giving you plenty of time to prepare. And thanks to existing relationships with donors, lobbyists, and special interests, you'll likely be able to outspend your opponent significantly. You can see that as an incumbent, you've got some pretty huge advantages before campaigning even really begins. People for term limits say these advantages are unfair and make it harder for new voices to break into politics. Now imagine instead you were running as a new candidate. Sure, you may have plenty of friends and family who you know will vote for you, but that alone won't be enough. You're going to have to go out and introduce yourself to the people you hope to represent. You need to explain your platform to them and convince them that you are the person best suited to fight for their interest. And that means knowing what their interests are right now. It probably also means more face-to-face meetings and more individual donors. People for term limits would argue that, for these and other reasons, newer representatives are more in touch with the needs of the people. So with term limits, your representatives might be more likely to work on issues that matter to you. Finally, here's an argument specifically for us in Arkansas. As I mentioned earlier, the 12-year limits we have now are a result of an amendment voters passed in 2014. Some people point to the language used for that amendment and say it was worded to trick voters. How? Well, this particular amendment, which was referred from the legislature, had a whole lot of parts to it, many of them dealing with ethics reform in government. In both the extremely long title of the bill, as well as the language that appeared on the ballot, it mentions setting or establishing term limits, with no mention of the fact that they already existed and passing the amendment would actually extend them. If you went into the voting booth without doing your research first, you might assume that an ethics reform law would tighten controls, not loosen them. Folks in favor of term limits argue that the legislature deceptively hid the clause for extending the existing limits inside of a bill full of other things they knew most voters would love because it would never pass on its own. This is part of the reason the new amendment includes the rule that in the future, term limits can only get on the ballot by way of citizens' petition, not by being referred from the legislature. On the other side, people against term limits would argue that they take away your right to keep a legislator you like in office. If you've got a representative who has served 2 or 3 terms but you still think they're doing great work, shouldn't you have the freedom to keep them? People against term limits also argue that if a legislator knows their term is limited, they might be more willing to pass bills which have negative long-term consequences, knowing they won't be around to have to take the blame. Also, some projects you might want your legislator to undertake could require years of work and planning. Legislators serving their final term might be less ambitious and forward-thinking, knowing there's no chance they could see long-term projects to their end. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, people against term limits point out that a major value of a legislator who has been in office for a while is their accumulated experience, relationships, and knowledge of the process. This is known as institutional memory or institutional knowledge, and is not something that can just be handed off to whoever is next elected to the position. If you've ever held a job for a long time, you're probably familiar with this concept. Even if the company hired someone to replace you who was familiar with the technical workings of your position, knowledge of the company, the workspace, and the quirks of your coworkers all serve to make you better at your job than a similar worker without that experience. Legislators are the same way. Politicians who've been in office longer understand the ins and outs of the job. They've also already had to work with the General Assembly staff and volunteers, the governor, and other legislators, so they may be able to work more efficiently and effectively as a result. And if you're worried about the effect of money on politics, keep in mind that if legislators are constantly turning over, the lobbyists and special interest groups can become the ones with the most institutional knowledge and might be able to take advantage of less experienced legislators. This potentially gives more power to people we didn't elect. So how should you vote? Well, if you believe that term limits lead to less corruption, or you want to fight the huge advantage of incumbent candidates, or you believe term limits keep legislators more in touch with the people they represent, or you believe that the current term limits were passed deceptively and should revert back to what they were, then vote yes. On the other hand, if you believe voters should have the right to keep a good candidate in office for as long as they like, or if you believe that term limits might mean legislators do things with more short-term gains at the expense of the future, or if you believe the loss of institutional knowledge could make our government function worse and possibly be more prone to influence from experienced lobbyists, then vote no. So that's issue 3, term limits. But this episode is a 2-for-1, so let's not waste any time and jump straight into issue 4, casinos. Issue 4 would legalize gambling for 4 licensed casinos in Arkansas. 2 of these would go to existing animal racing tracks, Southland Greyhound Park in West Memphis and Oaklawn Horse Racing Track in Hot Springs. 2 additional licenses would be available for creating one near Pine Bluff and another one near Russellville. These casinos would be regulated by the Arkansas Racing Commission, who would also be in charge of setting up the application process for the 2 available licenses. This amendment also defines what kind of gambling will take place, including traditional casino staples like card games, dice games, and slot machines, as well as betting on sports, which was legalized nationally earlier this year. It also specifies the casinos can be open 24/7 and are allowed to serve alcohol, even though one will be located in a dry county. This amendment sets a tax rate on the casino's yearly net take at 13% for the first $150 million and 20% after that. As far as where the taxes would go, 55% go to the state, 17.5% are split between Southland and Oaklawn to be used for race winnings, and the rest would be split between the city and the county the casino is located in. The amendment would require that the Racing Commission put aside a minimum of $200,000 a year, which would go to the Department of Human Services to use for programs which prevent and treat gambling addiction. Finally, the amendment makes it clear that it does not change or revoke the existing Arkansas laws against gambling anywhere outside of these 4 casinos. So what are the laws right now? Currently, Arkansas prohibits gambling houses, gaming devices, and betting on any machines. However, racetracks are legal, and racetracks can have electronic gambling machines if the city they are in vote to approve them, and the games are not completely random, as in human input has to change the outcome. You'll sometimes hear the 2 racetracks that have this, Southland and Oaklawn, referred to as casinos, but those places don't have card games, dice games, or the newly legalized sports betting. This is not the first time gambling has been on the Arkansas ballot. Voters have rejected casino proposals again and again, including in 1984, 1996, and 2000. Proposals almost made it to the ballot in 2012 and 2016, but both were removed for technical reasons. It's also worth mentioning that the Downstream Development Authority, who owns Downstream Casino in Quapaw, Oklahoma, and Cherokee Nation Businesses, LLC, who own the Cherokee Casino in West Siloam Springs, Oklahoma, have donated a combined $1.8 million to the Issue 4 campaign. These 2 groups have also expressed interest in applying for the 2 available licenses. So what are the arguments for this amendment? The one you'll see most often is the idea that people in Arkansas want to go to casinos, but because there aren't any here, they take their business to other states, losing us not only casino taxes, but money spent on travel and lodging as well. Of the states that surround Arkansas, Tennessee outlaws casinos entirely, and Missouri allows them only on riverboats. In Mississippi and Louisiana, they can be on riverboats, close to the river, or on Native American land, and in Oklahoma and Texas, they're only legal on Native American land. So if you look at a map of casinos in the area, you can see a line of them to the southeast, riverboats on the Mississippi, and a huge number of them to the west, on tribal lands in Oklahoma. This means that a lot of Arkansans, if they want to gamble, have relatively easy access. People for this amendment argue that casinos in Arkansas would keep some of that revenue here. Also, 3 of the 4 licenses are for locations relatively central to the state, so they won't be competing for business in those areas where casinos already exist. A second argument for this amendment is that the casinos will create jobs and bring in large amounts of state and local tax revenue. Casinos can definitely create a lot of jobs, many of them entry-level positions. They can also bring business booms to cities, especially ones that are small or struggling. Driving Arkansas Forward, the group running the PR campaign in support of Amendment 4, say it would create $5.8 billion in economic impact, bring $120 million in annual gaming tax revenue, and create 6,000 new jobs. These numbers are based on a study they commissioned by the Arkansas Economic Development Institute. A final argument in favor of this amendment is that it would bring back state funding for gambling addiction programs. When the Arkansas Lottery started back in 2009, the state agreed to set aside $200,000 a year to fund gambling addiction counseling. But then in 2015, the state cut all of that funding. Since then, the program has only been running on donations. This amendment guarantees at least $200,000 annually to the Arkansas Department of Human Services to fund gambling addiction programs. So what are the arguments against this amendment? The first and simplest is that instead of setting up just 4 licenses, why not just legalize casinos for the whole state, or allow individual cities or counties to make the decision? By creating a set number of licenses, predetermining who 2 of them go to, and setting where the other 2 will be geographically, this law creates a weird sort of state-sponsored monopoly. And even if Oaklawn and Southland would be likely to get a license if they were forced to go through the review process, bypassing that and writing those companies into the state constitution is a step too far for some people. In the same vein, some people would argue it's unfair that our entire state gets to vote on something that will so heavily affect 4 specific cities. Even if a majority of people in each of those cities vote against this amendment, it doesn't matter so long as the state passes it. The only additional requirement, which is just for the 2 non-assigned licenses, is that the applicant has to get a letter of support from either the county judge or the quorum court, as well as one from the mayor if it's going to be within the city limits. That local choice could be important, especially when you look at taxes. As I said, 55% of the taxes from casinos will go to the state, and 27.5% will either be split between the county and the city, or just go to the county if the casino is outside city limits. The assumed increase in visitors could require local spending on everything from additional road maintenance to hiring and training police, and even things like trash and sewage. These costs come largely from the city and county, potentially offsetting a significant amount of their take of the taxes. Meanwhile, the state takes twice as much while bearing less of the burden. Another argument against this amendment is that the companies who receive these licenses could be from outside outside Arkansas, which might mean profits don't get invested back into the local economy. While Oaklawn is locally owned and operated, Southland is owned by the Delaware North Company, headquartered in Buffalo, New York. And the two groups I mentioned before who are interested in the two available licenses are both based in Oklahoma. Though there's no guarantee they'll receive them, they've invested a lot of money in this amendment passing, presumably with the intent to get some kind of return on that investment. Another argument about the financial impact comes from the Arkansas Department of Finance and Administration, who disagree with the numbers being used by the Amendment 4 campaign. In the report I talked about earlier, there were actually two sets of financial forecasts, a best case and a worst case. The difference between them is how quickly the casinos will be built, whether they can start partial operation while still under construction, and their expected income. The campaign for this amendment is using the most favorable predictions, but the state DFA thinks the lower ones are more realistic. A big reason for that is that the casino tax rate this amendment puts in place is lower than what Southlawn and Oakland are paying right now. Currently, those businesses pay a tax of 35%. The new tax rate, 13% on the first $150 million and 20% on the rest, would apply as soon as this bill passes, but it would be a few years before other casinos could open and their taxes could offset that loss. The Department of Finance and Administration estimates that the loss to the state would be about $36 million a year for the next 2 years. People against this amendment also question the effects it might have on citizens of the 4 cities and the surrounding areas. Casinos are generally all-inclusive. Your entertainment, food, drink, and sleep are all in the same place, so people visiting a city for a casino are not as likely to support local businesses as they might be for other types of tourist attractions. As for the people who live near casinos, their chance of problematic gambling issues increases, and the promised minimum $200,000 to be directed towards state programs to combat gambling addiction only brings that budget back to the level where it was supposed to be to cover the already existing needs, the level it was supposed to be at before these casinos were built. Without a much larger guaranteed commitment, opponents say these casinos are not properly addressing a problem they create, or at least exacerbate. Also, the impoverished are far more likely to gamble, which can lead to a larger gap between the poor and the wealthy in areas where casinos are built. Some studies also link casinos with higher crime rates, bankruptcy, or divorce rates, though the effect is relatively small. So how should you vote? Well, if you believe the casinos will be a significant financial gain for the state, closer to the more optimistic predictions, and you believe that the potential jobs, local growth, and tax dollars are worth risking the possible downsides, then vote yes. On the other hand, if you think that creating these 4 specific licenses leads to a state-sponsored monopoly, or if you think it's unfair that the cities where they will be located don't have more say and might end up benefiting significantly less than the rest of the state, or if you believe the less optimistic financial predictions and think the possible risk isn't worth the potential benefits, then vote no. And that's it! Thanks so much for sticking through this double episode. I wanted to make sure I got this out quickly since early voting starts soon. I'm still going to do an episode for issue 5 and get that out before Election Day, so if you want to see that, or whatever else comes out next, be sure to subscribe. And if you want to help make sure these videos keep coming, please support ArkanSense on Patreon. Patreon is like Netflix or Hulu, but for artists. Each month you pay a specific amount to support me continuing to make content. The exact amount is up to you, and bigger rewards get bigger perks. Speaking of perks, I'd like to thank our 2 Wampus Cat level sponsors, Jason Sanders and W. Don Hughes. If you want to support the show, check out the link below, and thanks for watching.